Section 4. What is a properly arranged system of private property? What system of property does Aristotle advocate? But the way that exists now concerning property, if adorned with character and an order of correct laws, would differ not a little from the communism of property. For it would have what is good from both. By from both, I mean from possessions being common in some way, but private generally. Property is to remain private, but with some adornments that give it the advantages of common as well as of private property. What these adornments are will be seen later. Although private property is clearly better than communism of property, property should still be common in some sense. Its use should be common. It will be through virtue that, with regard to use, the things of friends are common, as the Proverbs say. It turns out that this is not necessarily a radical suggestion. Even now, this is the way it is in some cities in outline, so it is not impossible. And in finely managed cities, most of all, some of these things exist, while some of them could come to be. Property will be common in use through virtue, whatever that means, but Aristotle also says, it is evident that it is better for possession to be private, but to make them common in use. That they, the citizens, become such as to use possessions in common, this is a special function of the legislator. There are several questions that must be answered if we are to fully understand Aristotle's view on property. First, what exactly does he mean when he says property should be used in common? Next, how private is private property? That is to say, surely there will be some common or public property, but how much? To what extent, if any, will private property be limited and regulated? Finally, how does the legislator make citizens become such as to use their property in common and properly? Does he simply pass laws to that effect? We shall proceed to answer these questions beginning with Politics 2.5. Let us start by looking at the common use of private property. The first thing to be said is that there seem to be degrees of common use. For each owning possessions privately, some things are made useful to his friends, while some are used in common. Aristotle is talking here about two different kinds of sharing, both of which constitute making what I own common in use. Some things I share in common with certain people, for instance, close friends, but not with others. And some things I make available to everyone, or all citizens. Each citizen will share some, but not all, of his possessions with his close friends, but not with everyone, whereas some other possessions he will make available to all of his fellow citizens. The level of friendship will determine just how common one makes his possessions. Aristotle gives an example. In Lake Damon, they use each other's slaves as their own, so to speak, as well as horses and dogs and provisions for travel, if they need any, from the farms throughout the territories. This passage becomes a bit clearer if read in conjunction with Xenophon's discussion of these arrangements in Lake Damian Constitution. And Lycurgus made it such that if anyone needed to, he could use someone else's servants, and he joined together a community of hunting dogs, so that those needing them invite the owner to go to the hunt. But if he does not himself have the time to go, he sends the dogs with pleasure. And they use horses in the same manner. For one who is sick or is in need of a carriage or wishes to go somewhere quickly, if he sees there is a horse somewhere, after taking it and using it properly, he restores it. Wherever people coming late from a hunt are in need of provisions, if they did not happen to have packed anything, he also set it down that in that case those who possess something should leave behind the leftover prepared food, while those in need break the seals, take however much they need, return what is left over, sealing the container. Accordingly, in this way, giving shares to each other, those who have little partake in all of the things in the region, whenever they need something. In Xenophon's account, property is private, and there is concern and respect for private property. If someone owns something, however, and is not using it, or will not be using it in the case of leftovers, he should make these things available to his fellow citizens. As a consequence, those who otherwise would not be able to have the advantages of a horse, or take part in a hunt, or the like are able to. Aristotle would seem to agree with this much, given that he chose these practices to illustrate a system he praises. So far, we know that common use involves sharing servants, horses, hunting dogs, and food for the hunt. What else is shared? In his summary of the practices of Lacedaemonians, Aristotle mentions provisions for travel from the farms throughout the territory. Although this may simply be a generalization from the principle whereby leftovers should be placed in containers, Aristotle most likely found this general principle an important part of what is to share one's property in common. For example, writing in the Athenian constitution, he says that Cimon maintained many of his fellow demesmen for any man of Laecidae who wished could go to him each day and obtain his basic needs, and all his land was unfenced, so that anyone wished could enjoy the fruit. One way a citizen, especially a wealthy citizen, can make the use of his private property common is to give needy citizens access to his lands. This is one important reason, others being the financing of the military and the arts, that Aristotle regards wealthy citizens as a crucial part of the city. Not only does generosity give the needy access to things from which they would otherwise be excluded, it also helps hold the city together. In Politics 6.5, Aristotle says, "It is also fine to imitate the practices of the Tarentines. For these people, making their possessions common in use for the poor, maintain the goodwill of the multitude." As was mentioned before, Aristotle thinks there should be different degrees of what one is willing to make useful to others. Perhaps he believes the common use of servants and hunting dogs will be more limited. That is, I might share them, but not with just anyone. Whereas the practices mentioned earlier with horses or food in the fields will be more communal. One important question concerning common use remains. Is such use voluntary, or is it to be enforced by law? Martha Nussbaum claims the latter is the case. She says, Aristotle's insistence on common use, that it ought to be possible for a needy person to help herself to your crops without penalty and with goodwill, shows that in any case he did not defend private ownership in the form in which most contemporary thought defends it. In a note to this passage, she continues, one might fruitfully compare to this housing policies that have been adopted in some socialist or social democratic countries, giving the homeless certain rights towards unoccupied or luxury housing. I believe Nussbaum has failed to grasp the essential nature of Aristotle's view that property should be private generally, but common in use. First, according to Aristotle, when I make my property, that is private, common in use, I do so from virtue and in the manner of friends. This certainly sounds voluntary. Second, Nussbaum's conception of common use seems to conflict with Aristotle's conception of what it is for property to be private. In the Rhetoric, he writes that something is one's own whenever the ability to dispose is with oneself. And I mean by dispose, giving and selling. Generally, being wealthy is in the using more than in the possessing. While describing the best city in the Politics 7.10, Aristotle says it is necessary to discuss the distribution of land. As a prelude to such a discussion, he mentions the following 4 points. 1. Possession should not be common, but should become common in use in a friendly way. 2. No citizen should lack sustenance. 3. Concerning common messes, all agree it is useful for them to belong to well-equipped cities. The reason for which we agree will be stated later. All citizens should share in these, but it is not easy for the poor to contribute the said or required amount from their private funds and manage the rest of their household. 4. Expenses relating to the gods are, or should be, common to the whole city. Given these 4 points, how should property be arranged for those who wish to live in the best regime? Aristotle believes that in order for a city to count as the best one could hope for, it would have to have, among other things, the division of territory described in Politics. Taking it for granted that the city will also have territory on which government buildings, for example the assembly, will stand, and putting that land aside, the following describes how the rest of the land would be distributed. Part of the land should be common, and part should be private. These two parts should further be divided such that part of the public land houses common messes and produces crops, and possibly funds that enable all to participate in them, while another part supports public service to the gods. The private land will be divided such that every citizen will possess land near the city as well as land near the frontier. There is, however, no indication of how exactly the city's land is to be divided, so we cannot assume, as Nussbaum does, that fully half of the city's land will be held in common. Let us focus now on public or common land. There should be land to house government buildings, temples, and common mess halls, as well as land that produces enough income to support their maintenance, or part of that maintenance, including perhaps pay for those involved in their upkeep. City-owned land would produce crops and livestock, and perhaps precious metals to support these institutions. The city might also rely on other surplus revenues. Although they are sometimes warranted, Aristotle does not emphasize taxes, especially not in his discussion of the best city. We shall speak more of this later. In Politics 2.9, Aristotle criticizes the Spartan system of common messes and praises the Cretan system. The law concerning common messes has not been framed finely by the one first establishing it, for the gathering should rather exist from common funds as in Crete. But among the Spartans everyone must pay, even some who are exceedingly poor and not able to afford this expense. It is not easy for the very poor to participate in the common mess, but this is the definition of the regime among them, passed down from their fathers. The one who is not able to pay this fee is not to participate in it, that is, in the regime. In Politics 2.10, he again comments on the superiority of the Cretan system of common messes. In Crete, the common mess is set up in a more common manner, for from all the crops and livestock that come from the public lands and from tribute, which the subjects pay, one part is set aside for the gods and for the common liturgies, and another for the common messes, so that everyone, women, children, and men, is maintained from the common funds. The land on which the common messes stand is common land, and the common crops and funds, which come from the common lands, should ideally pay for the common meals of everyone. But how extensive are common meals? It seems quite clear, unless Aristotle was intending something entirely radical, that they took place every day and once a day. It was the main meal of the day, which took place at sunset. But who was allowed to attend? Despite what Aristotle says, it seems that the Cretan common messes were attended by adult male citizens, including the poor, and boys. Women, Dosiadus tells us, were in charge of the meals, but they did not seem to partake in them. There is no mention of daughters anywhere. It is of course possible that Aristotle read into or embellished earlier accounts of the Cretan common messes a bit, much like Plato in the laws may have, so that men, women, and children all received meals there. In any case, it is fairly clear that Aristotle himself supports the inclusion of women in common meals. So Aristotle wants the city to see to it that each citizen and his family receives at least the main meal of the day. In this way, the basic sustenance of every citizen is guaranteed.